In this level, we're going to look at the key questions in economics and why we study economics. Well, economics is the science of choice. And because all individuals make choices, what job to take, how many hours to work, whether to go on vacation, businesses make decisions, right? What product should we make? How much should we make? What price should we sell it for? So all these choices that individuals, businesses, and institutions make is really what economics is about. And so because all the decisions that we make are choices, really economics is all these things. And as well, economics and life in general, everything really has a market. Everyone and everything has a market. So supply and demand are really fundamental pieces of our lives. So, for example, when we look at what to buy, then as households, we consider the price when we decide on our quantity that we're going to consume. So if the price of something is too high, the amount that we want is going to be fairly low. We can't afford it. We don't want it that badly. When prices are low, if it's something that we like, we can now afford more of it. So the quantity we want is high. So we have demand for goods and services in our lives. At the same time, businesses that provide those goods and services are supplying them. And at higher prices, they can make more profit. And so they're willing to sell more. And so it is that demand and supply that determine the price of things that we buy and sell. But in economics, it's not just about prices. It's about value and determining value. There's demand, those who want something, and there's a value they place on it. There's supply, or those who provide it, and the value they place on it. So when we look at the choices that are made by individuals, which economics is the science of choice, we look at how those values compare. And when we can find when the person who is willing to provide something, the value to them is equal to the value of someone who wants it, then we have a transaction, we have a market. And so everything and everyone really is a market because there are those who want something, those who provide something, and it's really about the value we place on it. So later this semester, we're going to look at the value of human life. Can you place a value on it? In my previous life, that was part of my job, was to look at, in wrongful death cases, really, how much could you compensate someone for the loss to their family? So everything and everyone has a market, and everything is really economics because we're looking at the choices that are made. So really comes down to supply and demand. Here we looked at the value to a household and to a business for a particular product. We can also look at supply and demand in terms of setting interest rates. So the Bank of Canada has a fixed amount of money that it has in circulation. There's an amount of money that we want to buy things, do things with, and that's going to impact the interest rate. So if, for example, the Bank of Canada decides to print more money, there's now more cash in circulation. It's easy to find people to lend you money. Interest rates go down. If more of us want to borrow money, so I'm just going to go back here. More of us want to buy houses and cars, then what we see is that there's more people who want access to money, so demand goes up, and that's going to drive up interest rates. So supply and demand determine prices, they determine interest rates, they determine wages. So when we look at the workforce, there is demand for workers. So businesses, if wages are high, they can't afford to hire many people. So here we are at high wages, the quantity will be fairly low. If wages are low, then businesses can now afford to hire more workers, and so the quantity will be much higher. So we can see, again, here is demand for workers. There's also supply of workers. So we each decide how much we're willing to work and at what value. So for example, if wages were $1 an hour, would you work at all? Would you be better off just staying at home and enjoying your leisure time? So at low wages, the quantity of us who are willing to work is low. At high wages, more of us are willing to work. And it is where the value of the work from the business perspective is equal to the value of the work from the worker's perspective. That determines the wage that you get paid, right? You take a job and you look at, is that a wage I am willing to work for? And an employer says, I'm willing to hire that person for that value. So economics is really looking at demand and supply and determining value. So we have wages, we have prices, we have interest rates, all set by supply and demand. Well, let's look at a particularly interesting market, and this one has to do with the NBA and LeBron James. So if we look at the market for LeBron James to be a member of your basketball team, we have demand and supply. Now, when we look at demand to have LeBron on your team, you have to consider that there are different wages you could pay him to be on your basketball team. And in fact, when the Cavaliers lost LeBron James, they lost $120 million. So that would say that that team really valued him at $120 million. Okay. When he went to Miami, Miami gained about $60 million a year. So that would mean the value to that team was about $60 million. So different number of teams and individuals value his talent as an all-star athlete at different amounts. What are they willing to pay for him to be on their team? So at high wages, right, if we're looking at the $120 million a year price tag to pay him, there's not a lot of teams that can afford to pay him that amount. Okay, so the quantity is going to be lower when the wage is much higher. Well, if LeBron was willing to work for, say, $10 a year, right, then everyone would want to hire him, including you and me wanting to hire him for our pickup basketball games. So the quantity would be very high. So we have to look at what is the demand for the athlete. What are businesses willing to pay? How much do they value his skills? Okay. Then we also have to consider the supply. When we're looking at athletes and unique talent, we don't have that upward sloping supply curve like we just saw with general workers. We have a fixed supply curve. And that's because their unique talents of the individual mean that the quantity is one. One person has those unique talents. So if we look at the fact that he is unique in his abilities, then when we look at the wage that he should be offered, and I think in 2018 he was looking at moving to the LA Lakers, how much should he get paid? Well, the amount that he gets paid is a combination of both what he's willing to work for and what the team is willing to pay. So we know that there's a few number of teams that could afford to pay that higher value, and we know that there are teams that value him between $60 and $120 million. Okay, because he's unique, right? There's not a lot of competition in terms of other people being able to fill that spot. Now, if there were, so if his unique capabilities as an athlete were comparable to, let's say, two other individuals, then that increase in supply, now there's more people that can fill that role, there's now competition. And so when these NBA teams look to hire a player, they now have 3 athletes to choose from. And so that would actually drive down the wage, because now you can get any of the 3 individuals, not just the one. Well, let's go back. Okay. So we have one person, LeBron James, with unique abilities and talents as a basketball player. We have a high demand for him. He's worth a lot because he is unique, and the value to the teams is quite high. Now, the challenge with NBA is that there is a price ceiling. So if we say, okay, well, according to the market, He's worth at least $60 million a year. That's how much he should be paid based on the value to the team and the scarcity, the fact that he's the only one with such skills. Well, in the NBA, there is a cap on the amount you can pay your players. And that cap is 35% of the league salary, or about $35.7 million here. Okay. So even though LeBron James should be getting paid $60 to $120 million, because of the cap, he can't be paid that amount. This is what is called a price ceiling, and we're going to look at price ceilings later this semester. Another example would be rent control, where you can't charge above a certain price on rents of an apartment. Okay, so the challenge here is that when we implement a price ceiling, then we have one player, but now because the price or the wage to hire this particular player is much lower, there's a lot more teams who would like to have him. So the idea here with the price ceiling is to make these elite players more accessible to more teams. So it's not just the super wealthy NBA teams that could hire him. He could now be hired to other teams. The challenge this creates, of course, is that the amount of teams who want to hire him now far exceeds the number of players, right? He's just one guy. So what happens? Well, when we look at other price ceilings, what is created because the quantity demanded exceeds the quantity supplied, because there is such a shortage, we tend to see is trying to get a workaround, right? So in a price ceiling on an apartment, we might jack up the price of the parking spot that goes with it, make it lots of money because we can't charge you more for the apartment. So it tends to try to kind of be sweeteners, bribes, to try to get around this. And so this price cap that exists, salary cap that exists within the NBA, creates this incentive for these NBA teams to create sweeteners besides the salary to try to entice players to come to their team. It also creates a challenge for the player themselves because, as you can see, LeBron James, his value as a player much exceeds the price that, or the salary that can be placed as a player of the NBA. So when we start to see interference in the markets don't like to not be at equilibrium. But whether we're looking at the wages of an elite athlete, or we're looking at our own wages, or we're looking at the prices that we pay for goods, we can see the role of economics, looking at demand and supply in the choices that we make. And ultimately, what happens is based on the value of not just our perspective, but others in the market.